I had been meaning to make a video about this whole James Blake situation since last week, but I had been too busy working on other projects to really make a comment on it. But now that I know a little bit more of the facts regarding the situation, I'm going to make a video about it. Now, James Blake is the latest black man to be profiled and attacked by police officers. And we find that this police officer, just like the one who choked out Eric Garner, has a history of complaints against him and a series of infractions against him. I'm starting to see a pattern in this NYPD regarding bad officers. We look at the history here and we look at this officer and we compare him to Officer Michael, Daniel, whatever you call him, Pantaleo, who choked out Eric Garner. We see the same pattern of behavior. We see the same pattern from management regarding this type of out of control behavior, which is a hands off policy. And we see the same policy from the executive branch of the New York City um, mayor's office, Bill DeBlasio, regarding these incidents. Now, the mayor and the police commissioner went and gave James Blake an apology, but to me, this is not constructive action. You have a pattern and practice here of police officers abusing African American men. And instead of you taking constructive action, which is to terminate these bad officers, they give the officer a pat on the wrist, and then send them off to continue doing the same type of work. Because well, 1 year later, after Daniel Pantaleo choked out Eric Garner, he's back on the job, and they're getting ready to put him back on the street. How is that constructive? This is an officer who has killed a man, has had two federal civil rights lawsuits against him, and has had a civil lawsuit against him. He's a complete screw up. And in any other municipality, a screw up like this would just be told to go find a job elsewhere and that they are not fit for duty. Even in the U.S. military, a guy like this would have been terminated. They would have given him a dishonorable discharge and sent him on his way. But because the NYPD has a pattern and practice of supporting bad officers over good, these guys still continue to remain on the payroll after making mistake after mistake after mistake. And when you have people like this in positions of power and management supporting them, it creates a culture of dysfunction. And this is what I'm seeing regarding all of these incidents, not just the James Blake situation, but the Eric Garner situation and many others. What I'm seeing is a pattern and a practice, and this is a culture that comes from the top down. And the whole thing is that when we look at the whole policies of this DeBlasio administration, their hands-off policies, this is what's really causing a strain on relationships between law enforcement and the African American community, because he's not making the effort to get these officers terminated for their misconduct. When I looked at that tape with James Blake, that was totally mishandled. It was totally taken out of control. Here we have an officer tackling a man over credit cards. Now, the proper procedure for this case would have been to just approach the man, identify yourself, and ask for identification, and then that would have been the end of it. But no, this guy is going gung-ho. He's tackling a man who has no idea that this guy is even where he is. And I have to agree with James Blake. This man should be fired, especially when you look at his record of two. This guy also has civil rights lawsuits against him. He has numerous civilian complaints. There is no place for that type of individual on a police department. I mean, if this is a case regarding credit cards, you go and approach the person, you ask for ID, and then identify yourself, ask for ID, and if that's the case, you ask some questions, and that's it. And that's how you solve that whole situation. But this guy, because he wants to be Mr. Superhero, just like the officer in McKinney, Texas, who was forced to, I think he was forced to resign after he attacked that black girl. Um, he wants to be Mr. Gung Ho, Mr. Tough Guy. I'm going to tackle a man in front of people so that I can look like a tough guy. And really, all he did was make the department look bad. When you have individuals like this in your department, it makes the whole department look bad. And it takes, and the whole thing is that it requires a strong manager and a strong leader to rein in people like this. And even if you can't discipline them, and in this case, again, just like the officer who choked out Eric Garner, it seems like discipline has not worked with this person. It's time to terminate them and get rid of them because they make everybody look bad. This is the bad apple that spoils the bunch and spoils community relations between the NYPD and the community. And the sad part about this whole big picture is you have a Democratic mayor who is just sitting there with his hands holding his folded up and not taking any constructive action to rein in all of these bad officers in spite of all the protests, all the marches, and all of the incidents that have followed. And what's really sad about it is that your African Americans and your black community cannot connect the dots regarding this Democratic mayor and his total nonchalance regarding your New York Police Department. And, you know, he's the executive branch of government. He's the one that everybody has to answer to. And his whole attitude regarding Eric Garner and this James Blake situation has to be hands off and to just be nonchalant and to be indifferent. And your African American community cannot look at this mayor's actions and see that this guy really doesn't care about black people. Even though he is so-called married to a black woman and has biracial children, his actions show how little regard he has for black people. Because if he truly cared about black people, he would have made every effort to not only get the officer who tackled James Blake terminated, but to get the officer who choked out Eric Garner terminated. Because these are bad officers. They make the department look bad, and they destroy any hope or efforts to build good community relations between African Americans and the police department. As long as these type of officers continue to remain on the payroll and their misconduct remains undisciplined, what happens is your African American community relations between them and the police department continue to remain strained. And this is what happens when this is what happens when people don't really look at the big picture. When I look at the big picture regarding Bill DeBlasio's actions in the case of James Blake and the case of Eric Garner, and I put them together to form a comprehensive picture, it clearly shows again this Democratic mayor has no concern about black people. He has no regard for black people, and he has shown how little black lives matter to him in whether they be rich black people or poor black people. He really does not care enough to take the constructive action and say, look, these officers are out of control, their behaviors are out of control, and these guys pretty much, I don't want them representing my police department under my auspices. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have these officers terminated. I mean, if Rudy Giuliani can get Carol Shia fired for opposing in Playboy, why can't Bill de Blasio get Michael Pantaleo, and the officer in this case, fired for gross negligent misconduct? I mean, that's just the question black people need to start asking. Because if they ask that type of question, they would truly take a look at the picture and see that this Bill de Blasio cares little about black life as any other liberal out here or any Klansman out here. He does not care about black life at all because, again, if he cared about black lives, he would have just fired these two officers and made them an example so that the other officers in the NYPD would understand that this culture and this pattern in practice would not be tolerated. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.